This is a fan-generated show. If you'd like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our new Rumble channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to announce the release of my new book, Obama's True Legacy: How He Transformed America. There's a reason why Mike Huckabee calls it a ferocious and chilling read. Order it now at Amazon.com or at FrontPageMag.com. Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. With us this evening, Roger Stone, a seasoned political operative, speaker, pundit, and New York Times best-selling author. Presidents Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and Donald Trump all relied on him to secure their seat in the Oval Office. He's the best-selling author of the book The Man Who Killed Kennedy: The Case Against LBJ. Roger Stone, what an honor to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here. And, this is a topic, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, that is an eternal murder mystery. Americans are fascinated about it, even to this day. It's really quite extraordinary, given the mainstream media's pushing of the official Warren Commission narrative that Lee Harvey Oswald, a disgruntled Russian communist, a lone nut, killed John F. Kennedy acting alone. Yet the most recent Gallup poll shows that almost 73% of the American people don't believe that. And there's strong reasons why they shouldn't. So I wrote my book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy: The Case Against LBJ, in 2013. Jamie, I took it to 7 different publishers. You know what they told me? Nobody will buy this book. Nobody will be interested. Well, were they wrong? This book may put my grandchildren through college. So it was immediately a New York Times bestseller. Yeah. It's been, and I really don't promote it except for on the anniversaries of the tragic death of John F. Kennedy. Yet it has been kind of an evergreen bestseller, and I'm always anxious to talk about the subject.
Well, I am as well, Roger. So I'm so glad to have you here. And speaking of anniversaries, it's the 60th anniversary with just November 22nd that passed by us. Roger, I've been fascinated. It just means so much to speak to you this evening. I've been fascinated with this since I was 12, 13 years old. Especially Anthony Summers' book, Conspiracy, which really did something to me. And then I just reading and just thinking about this my whole life. And it's been a lot of years. And you did a brilliant job. So many things that you brought up, a lot of things that I didn't know. So it's not just the JFK assassination, which it is, about LBJ, etc. It's the history during that time. And, it's all these connections with the mob and what was going on with the CIA, etc. Roger, so let's begin. I'd like to begin in this way. There's so many things that you brought up, so maybe we'll do this a different way. Some things that people might not know. U.S. intelligence had some spies in the KGB, and it turns out that in the correspondence within the KGB, for them, it was a given that LBJ had done this. That's quite a fact.
Yeah, it's interesting that both Russian intelligence and French intelligence, when they conducted their own investigation after the murder of John F. Kennedy, they both reached the same conclusion, that Lyndon Johnson had been the driving force behind the murder of John Kennedy. Now, that is not to say that those who believe that Kennedy was murdered by the CIA are wrong. It's not to say that those who believe that he was killed by the mob are wrong. It's not to say that those who say he was the victim of Big Texas Oil is wrong. It's not to say that he was not a target of the Pentagon. Those are all correct. Your analysis of the Kennedy assassination all depends on your area of expertise. So, for example, the 1978 House Select Committee on Assassinations was staffed by people who had an expertise in organized crime and in the mafia. And therefore, they never questioned the CIA. They never got any documents from the CIA. They never got any testimony from the CIA. and therefore they had a preconceived conclusion. Again, a lot of people say, well, you say Lyndon Johnson did it. I say, no. What I say is Lyndon Johnson was at the helm of a plot that involved the Central Intelligence Agency, that involved the Secret Service, that involved the mafia, the mob, that involved Big Texas Oil, and involved the Pentagon, all of whom had their individual interest in the replacement of John and Robert Kennedy. Everybody had their own motive, but the one thing that all of those involved in this conspiracy, hate to use that word, have in common was the common thread of Lyndon Baines Johnson. So the Central Intelligence Agency's motives here are very clear. They blamed John F. Kennedy for the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, which was an unmitigated disaster. The truth is that the plan that they presented to John Kennedy for approval included 29 Panamanian flagged bombers that were supposed to be flown by Cuban pilots out of Panama to provide air cover for the men storming the beaches. At the last minute, the number 2 man in the CIA, Charles Cable, who interestingly, his brother Earl Cable was the mayor of Dallas and a crony of Lyndon Johnson, canceled that air cover. So when the men stormed the beach, as per the plan, they were cut to ribbons by Fidel Castro's sharpshooters. It was then that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Curtis LeMay, the head of the Air Force, went to Kennedy and said, well, there's only one way to save the day here, Mr. President, and that is to send in the U.S. Air Force. Kennedy refused to do that. He thought that there was air support included in the invasion plan. CIA blamed Kennedy for the failure. Kennedy blamed the agency. And Kennedy famously said afterwards that he would splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. A secondary motive of the Central Intelligence Agency was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the conventional wisdom, the media theme around the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's even a famous movie made about it, is that Nikita Khrushchev, the Russian dictator, put Cuban missiles 90 miles off our shore, and then brave John and Robert Kennedy basically faced him down. We were on the brink of a world war, and that Khrushchev folded. None of that is, of course, true. What the Central Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon knew in real time, but we didn't find out until 40 years later when the documents were declassified, is that the Kennedys made a secret deal with Khrushchev to remove American missiles from Turkey and Italy and Greece, changing the balance of power in the European theater in return for a promise from Castro that he would remove his missiles from Cuba, but there was never any on-site inspections involved in that arrangement. So the Central Intelligence Agency had a deep distrust of John Kennedy. They also became aware, and this is probably the most controversial part of my book, of John Kennedy's going to a doctor in New York, Dr. Max Jacobson, also known as Dr. Feelgood, who was giving John Kennedy a very early proprietary blend of methamphetamine, which Kennedy was taking to relieve the pain in his back. Remember, he was a severely injured World War II hero, but he was hooked. There's a great book on this called Dr. Feelgood, which I highly recommend it to you. But you can see how the Central Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon rationalize their decision. You see, the man he's a drug addict. He could give away the store to Khrushchev at any moment. This is, I think, how they rationalized their ultimate move against Kennedy. Then you had organized crime. Their motive is very clear. Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, went to the mob in 1959, late 1959, and said, my son is going to be president. I want $1 million for his campaign. Well, $1 million is a huge amount of money in 1959. Ultimately, some elements of the mob, Mickey Cohn, who ran the mob out of Los Angeles, and Camel Humphreys, who ran the mob out of Nevada. They objected. Why? Because they were financing the campaign of Richard Nixon and had been doing so since he went to the Senate. But Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob, Frank Costello, the New York mob, Carlos Marcello, who controlled the mob in Louisiana and Texas, and Santo Trafficante, one of the most vicious gangsters of all time, who controlled the mob out of Florida, agreed to put up $1 million. And in return, Ambassador Kennedy guaranteed the gangsters that once John Kennedy became president, that the efforts to deport Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello, currently being pursued by the Eisenhower Justice Department, would be dropped. They would be double-crossed when Robert Kennedy became Attorney General, when Ambassador Joseph Kennedy suffered from a debilitating stroke in which he lost the ability to speak. Therefore, he's no longer around to basically hold both sides to the deal. And the mob realized that they had been double-crossed. That is their motive. Big Texas Oil has a clear motive. John Kennedy wants to strip away the oil depletion allowance. That means that oil billionaires like H.L. Hunt and Clint Murchison and others would now be required to pay hundreds of millions more in taxes. And then, of course, there is the international banking community, because John Kennedy was committed to a silver-backed dollar, did not want to go off of the silver or gold standard to a paper-backed dollar, which is their motive. Now, each one of these entities has a unique relationship with Lyndon Johnson. Johnson, as the Senate Majority Leader, had taken the unprecedented step of appointing himself to the Subcommittee of Defense Appropriations, where the secret black box budgets for the CIA were maintained. He was the paymaster for the CIA. The CIA had exponential growth under Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson. When he became vice president, he handed that subcommittee off to a Johnson loyalist, Senator Harry F. Byrd of Virginia. Johnson had increased the FBI budget exponentially through the 50s. His next door neighbor, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, hated the Kennedys and knew that in 1964 he faced mandatory retirement age unless he got a waiver from President John Kennedy, which was unlikely because the Kennedy brothers had already begun telling people that Hoover was going to be retiring. And then, of course, the mob has their interests. Lyndon Johnson was on the pad for the mob. He was being paid by Carlos Marcello to protect the mob's illegal gambling operations in Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. The bagman there was a man named Jack Halfer. Halfer would actually go to prison for some other minor offense, and he would get a presidential pardon on November 24th, 1963. So you see Johnson's very clear connection to the mob. Elliot Janeway was kind of Wall Street's connection to Lyndon Johnson. And on behalf of the Wall Street and banking interests, Johnson was opposed to a silver-backed dollar. But the man who had the greatest interest in the murder of John F. Kennedy was Lyndon Johnson himself. He was under investigation in two huge corruption scandals. The Bobby Baker scandal. Baker was Johnson's right-hand man, the Secretary of the U.S. Senate. He was also Johnson's bag man. He was under investigation by Kennedy's Department of Justice. He's also under investigation by the U.S. Senate. And then there was Billy Sol Estes. Billy Sol Estes was a flamboyant Texas wheeler dealer. Johnson had arranged for him to get multi-million-dollar agricultural contracts from the federal government, and he was kicking back to Johnson. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who hated Johnson, knew all of this and had already begun telling people that Johnson would be dropped from the 1964 ticket. So there is the motive of everyone involved in the conspiracy and their connection to Lyndon Johnson. That's a good place to stop for a question.
Thank you so much, Roger. I had so many questions, but you've answered them all. Roger.
So we now talk about motive. Let's get to the issue of means. So
Absolutely, Roger. I'd like you to get to the to means. It's just once in a while here. I'll interject just with a picture in time, just with a picture in time, and then I'll give it to you and you continue. Oswald. No, 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 absolutely. I'll give it to you and then you just keep going. But just these pictures in time that you document. So, one picture in time. Oswald defects to the Soviet Union. He comes back, is not treated the way you would think a defector would have been treated. Then he gets arrested in New Orleans and calls U.S. intelligence to help him. His last phone call, it turns out, was to U.S. intelligence. The W-9, the 1099 that have come up in the documents, he was getting paid by U.S. intelligence. Very interesting, isn't it? With this character that's, giving out Marxist literature, this is all part of it, isn't it? Something's not adding up.
you make an excellent point. Lee Harvey Oswald is exactly what he says he is. Now, when he's paraded out in public after his arrest, what does he say? I'm a patsy. I didn't shoot anyone. And indeed, the test that he's submitted to by the Dallas Police Office demonstrates that he has no nitrate burns on his chest or on his arms. So it was very clear that he had not shot a leaky $29 Carcano World War II vintage Italian carbine that day. He is exactly what he says he is. He has worked for both the FBI and the CIA. As I demonstrate in my book, he was trained in the Russian language at the CIA's language school in North Carolina. He actually, I believe, is put in place believing that his role that day is to prevent an attack on President John F. Kennedy, only to learn that he's the guy they leave holding the bag. They said, oh, he was seen bringing a rifle bag into the office. No, he was seen bringing a fishing pole in a carrying case into the Texas School Book Depository building. So he is indeed a patsy. He's set up. It's actually physically impossible for him to have killed John F. Kennedy, only because getting off 3 bullets, all allegedly from behind. We know the exact time sequence because the Dallas police officer has left their microphone open on their radio, a motorcycle officer. So we know the time sequence. There was no way that Oswald, who was not that great a marksman, had the lowest score given by the Marine Corps, got off 3 shots, was able to hide the rifle, go down 2 flights of stairs from the 6th floor, 4 flights of stairs from the 6th floor to the 2nd floor, where he was casually seen eating his lunch minutes after John F. Kennedy was killed, where he was witnessed by a Dallas police officer. And indeed, a woman whose name I think was Victoria, I want to say Victoria Hill, not sure that's correct, was on the staircase. The power was turned off, by the way, in the Texas School Book Depository building. And she never saw, but more importantly, never heard Oswald on this creaky wooden staircase. So there's no question that Lee Harvey Oswald is exactly what he says he is, a patsy. Now, that leads us to the obvious question of who did shoot John F. Kennedy if it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald? In all honesty, I believe that there are multiple shooters based on the recent documentary in which many of the doctors who attended John F. Kennedy at Parkland Memorial Hospital have only recently, within the last several weeks, come forward in this powerful new documentary saying that the Kennedy that they observed at Parkland had sustained wounds from both the front and the back. That indicates multiple shooters. That in turn indicates a conspiracy. Oswald did not act alone, or whoever shot Kennedy did not act alone. We also have had very recently the 88-year-old retired Secret Service agent Paul Landis came forward, told the New York Times that he found a bullet lodged in the back of Kennedy's limousine, that he personally took it into Parkland Hospital and placed it on the stretcher next to the wounded John Kennedy. That blows apart their single bullet theory, this whole idea that there were only 3 bullets shot, all from the rear. One of those bullets had hit Kennedy, had hit Kennedy and then went on to wound Governor John Connally. That is, of course, a fabrication. I think that there are probably, there could be as many as 4 shooters. There is a shooter from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. We know that because on the cardboard boxes, the so-called crow's nest from which Oswald allegedly shot, we find the fingerprints of a man named Malcolm Mac Wallace. Wallace had been convicted of murder in 1951, basically when he killed a man who was trying to blackmail Lyndon Johnson, who was involved in a romantic relationship with Johnson's bohemian hippie type sister. And it is not incidental that at least 6 witnesses tell either the Dallas police or the FBI, none of this recorded in the Warren Commission report, that I saw a man in the window of the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building who was of medium build, balding, wearing glasses, and they all said he was wearing a tan jacket and light colored slacks. That is not the 125-pound Lee Harvey Oswald wearing a t-shirt. They also all describe a second man that they see who is dark complected, either Hispanic or Native American, and that is Lloyd Factor. Factor came forward after the murder saying that Mac Wallace had seen him shooting at a country fair outside of Dallas and hired him as a backup shooter for that day. But the Factor, by his own admission, said that he never had to shoot, that the shots from the 6th floor were all executed by Malcolm Mac Wallace. Wallace is later seen fleeing the Texas School Book Depository building by a man named James Carr, just a Dallas citizen, who makes the sorry mistake of telling the Dallas police what he has seen. There are no less than 6 attempts on Mr. Carr's life. He finally leaves Dallas, moves to the Midwest. Finally, when he gets subpoenaed for the investigation in New Orleans into the Kennedy assassination by District Attorney Garrison, there's yet another attempt on Mr. Carr's life. So he's seen the man, at least one of the men, responsible for the murder of John Kennedy. Now, I believe that there was another shooter on the grassy knoll behind the fence. There are multiple witnesses to that. Say they saw a man drive up in a green Plymouth station wagon, take out a rifle bag. Multiple people see a puff of smoke from the fence line on the grassy knoll. I think there's probably also a shooter in the sewer grate. Johnny Roselli, a very famous gangster, would later claim he was that man. Maybe, maybe not. My focus was on the connection to Johnson, and Malcolm Wallace's connection to Johnson is absolutely clear. He is working as an agriculture department employee in a patronage job arranged for by Lyndon Johnson. He had been tried in Texas for first-degree murder in 1951 when he killed this man, John Douglas Kinzer, who was trying to blackmail Johnson. He went to trial in Texas. He's the only man in Texas history to get a suspended sentence for first-degree murder. And then he immediately goes to work with a security clearance for a company called Temco, later known as General Dynamics, that is owned by D.H. Byrd, an oil man crony financier of Lyndon Johnson, who coincidentally owns one other major asset, the Texas School Book Depository building.
Roger, thank you. Another moment or couple moments in time here. So Johnson, as you document brilliantly, just fascinating book. I really enjoyed reading it. Kennedy, it appears, is going to drop Johnson from the ticket and not to be the VP in 64. Johnson shows up, meets Kennedy, and has some evidence about Kennedy's relations with this lady called Inga. That kind of changed things. Then Gerald Ford just changes a couple words in the Warren Commission, just changes a little couple sentences, and solidifies the ridiculous magic bullet theory. Gerald Ford also compromised by some evidence of his relations with, let me guess, a lady named Inga. Inga was used very much in these narratives. It's all very much connected to our topic, isn't it?
It is. A slight clarification. So in 1960, John Kennedy did not intend to take Lyndon Johnson as his running mate. He had decided on Senator Stuart Symington from Missouri. Then in Los Angeles, Speaker Sam Rayburn and Senator Lyndon Johnson showed up at Kennedy's hotel room demanding a meeting. With them, they had an envelope. From that manila envelope, they took out 8x10 pictures of John F. Kennedy in bed with this East German spy. Inga Arvid was her name. And Johnson was blunt. He said, look, you need me. You need Texas. I can deliver Texas. That means steal Texas. If not, well, this envelope's going to make its way over to Dick Nixon. And Kennedy changed his plans. This is the second part of the distaste that Robert Kennedy has for Lyndon Johnson. During the fight for the Democratic nomination, someone broke into John Kennedy's doctor's office in New York City and stole his medical records, which indicated that he had Addison's disease. And Lyndon Johnson arranged for Texas Governor John Connally and the Texas Democratic National Committee woman, whose name was India Evans, I think it was, to hold a press conference and reveal that John Kennedy, they said, was not healthy enough to be president because he had Addison's disease. Robert Kennedy always thought that was dirty pool, held it against Johnson, then was furious that Johnson had basically blackmailed his way onto the ticket.
Yes, and my apologies, I mixed that up. It wasn't that he was getting dropped from later, it was in 1960s to get on it.
That is correct.
Yeah, in 1960, yeah.
Now, the other thing you referred to, however, is very significant, and that is the Warren Commission. Originally, Johnson's idea was to have a Texas State Commission headed by Supreme Court Justice Tom Clark, another Johnson crony, segregationist, investigate the Kennedy assassination. He was persuaded that he needed a national commission and he needed a more respectable chairman. He went to Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was very reluctant to serve. But Johnson basically told Warren that if the American people ever realized the truth about this, well, we'd have World War III, implying that John Kennedy had been killed by the Russians or the Cubans, neither of which there is any evidence whatsoever of. And it is absolutely true and reported in the New York Times that at a certain point, they were having trouble getting some members of the Warren Commission to go along with the single bullet theory put forward by Chief Committee Investigator Arlen Specter, later a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania. It was Specter's theory that there had been only 3 bullets, all shot from behind, that one of those bullets had hit both Kennedy and end up lodged in the wrist of Governor John Connally. So at the request of J. Edgar Hoover, according to the oral histories of both William Sullivan and Deke DeLoach, who were the 2 top deputies of Hoover, at Hoover's request, Warren Commission member Gerald Ford, minority leader of the U.S. House, takes the official autopsy diagram as marked up by Kennedy's doctor, Admiral Berkeley, and he moves the depiction of the wound in Kennedy's upper back to his lower neck to accommodate the single bullet theory. Now, fast forward to this past year, the doctors at Parkland insisted that the wound on Kennedy's throat was not an exit wound, but was an entry wound. Therefore, that Kennedy had been shot from the front. By the time Kennedy's body gets to Bethesda Medical Center, a tracheotomy has been conducted so that you can't tell whether the throat wound is an exit wound or an entry wound. But also very suspicious is the fact that almost every one of the doctors in Parkland reports an enormous blowout wound in the left rear of Kennedy's head, consistent with being shot from the front, about the size of a grapefruit, they all say. But by the time Kennedy's body gets to Bethesda, that wound seems to have been patched, as literally has disappeared. The other part of this that's always remained a mystery to me is the famous Zapruder film. Abraham Zapruder was the man with a home movie camera who filmed the murder of John Kennedy. There is one other existing film that the government has suppressed, owned by a man named Nix. His family is still in litigation, even today, with the federal government to try to get access to that film. But Zapruder's film is only shown to one person prior to it being locked down, and that is the famous CBS journalist Dan Rather. Dan Rather says that in the film he watched, Kennedy's head is hit from behind and his head snaps forcefully forward. Well, we now know, having seen the Zapruder film, that that's a lie. Kennedy is hit from the front, and his head snaps back and to the left.
Rather lied.
Yes, no question about it. No question about it. And then, strangely enough, the Zapruder film doesn't stay in the possession of the U.S. government. It's sold immediately to the Time Life Corporation, and they lock it away for 50 years, and nobody is allowed to see it. Very strange.
Roger, you document that, Johnson's a couple vehicles behind Kennedy. He hits the bottom, ducks down, he hits the bottom within his vehicle before the shots begin. Later, his Secret Service guy says, oh no, he did that afterwards. But then he retracts it later and says Johnson told him to say that. Something not right there, right?
Yeah, we know from the newsreel footage and from the still photo footage by news photographers that Lyndon Johnson, who is riding in a Cadillac convertible, which is several car lengths behind JFK, hits the deck in his car prior to the first bullet being fired. Now, we know that because you see the photos, you see Lady Bird Johnson, you see Vice President Johnson, you see Texas Senator Ralph Yarborough. Then in the next photo, Johnson's missing, he's gone. Same thing in the newsreel photos. It is interesting that according to Jackie Kennedy's memories after the assassination, that the night before the assassination, Lyndon Johnson goes to Kennedy's hotel room in Fort Worth and tries to change the seating arrangement for the motorcade to move Texas Governor John Connally, his protege and confidant, to the vice presidential car, and move his hated rival, Senator Ralph Yarborough, progressive Democrat of Texas, to the president's car, the death car. John Kennedy rejects that because the entire premise under which he is going to Dallas to begin with is to try to pull together both wings of the Democratic Party for the 1964 election. Johnson and Connally representing the conservative Bourbon wing of the Democratic Party, where Senator Yarborough represents the labor-backed progressive Chicano wing of the Democratic Party. The whole idea was being seen with Connally. Kennedy needed to be embraced by Connally, so he rejected this change in the seating arrangements, and Johnson had no problem sending his protege, into the danger zone. There's no evidence that Connally, who is the man who insisted on the motorcade route through Dealey Plaza, why would you go through downtown when you could have gone from the airport to the merchandise mart, all on the freeway without ever even venturing into the downtown area? And of course, we know that the trip through Dealey Plaza violates multiple Secret Service requirements. All the buildings on both sides of the street are supposed to be searched and sealed. That didn't happen. There's supposed to be plainclothes Secret Service agents in the crowd. There are none. There's supposed to be 6 motorcycle officers, 3 abreast on either side of the presidential limousine. In fact, there's one motorcycle officer, and he is ordered to ride behind the presidential limousine. And then, lastly, and most importantly, under the regulations of the Secret Service, the presidential limousine is never supposed to come to a full stop. It comes to a full stop at a stop sign and takes a hard right. That is the moment, of course, in which multiple shooters shoot at John F. Kennedy, killing him. That's a
Yeah.
total violation of the Secret Service manual.
Yeah. Roger, Richard Nixon, it is said, wasn't much for chatter, but if he had a drink or two, he might become a little bit more talkative. If I am correct, he had a drink or two while you were with him one time, and you asked him about this issue. He said something very interesting to you.
Yeah, that's really what motivated me to write this book. In all honesty, look, I had been as a you much younger man, I'd been a Goldwater zealot. Already had written, I'd read a book called "A Texan Looks at Lyndon" by J. Evetts Haley, which outlined how incredibly corrupt Johnson was. I had no idea that he was literally a functioning lunatic. My book is also kind of a personal profile of Johnson. Johnson was an alcoholic. He was a pill popper. He was a womanizer. He was a chronic liar. He was epically corrupt. We're talking about bribes of biblical proportions. But beyond that, I had always had a fascination, and the official story of the murder of John F. Kennedy never really took with me. I was always somewhat skeptical. Uh, I would later work for former President Richard Nixon, handling his schedule and certain political chores. And what you say is absolutely true, that Nixon was not a retrospective man. He was not an introspective man. It was very hard to get him to talk about the past. Eisenhower, the clash with Joe McCarthy, his relationship with John Kennedy, the 1960 debates, being attacked by a communist mob in Venezuela. Except for when he had a cocktail or two. He, as you know, he prided himself on his martini making skills. He called them silver bullets. And it was one day in the study in Saddle River, New Jersey, when I saw my opportunity. We were on our second silver bullet. And I said, Mr. President, let me ask you a question. Uh, who really killed John Kennedy? First thing he said was, well, let me say this. The Warren Commission was the biggest goddamn hoax in American history. Now, it's interesting because he had told Pat Buchanan, his former speechwriter, the exact same thing. And I said, Mr. President, I don't understand. What are you saying? And he said, Kennedy was killed by Dallas. I said, what do you mean? You mean the right wingers in Dallas? He said, no. Let me put it to you this way. Lyndon and I both wanted to be president, but the difference was I wasn't willing to kill for it. It was that comment, which is reflected in my book, that inspired me to write this book. The other interesting piece of this is that, as I think everyone who was a student of American history knows, Lee Harvey Oswald never went to trial for the murder of John Kennedy because he was gunned down in public in cold blood by Jack Ruby, a man with known organized crime associations, although the Warren Commission said he had none whatsoever. But when Richard Nixon was watching this on TV, like millions of other Americans, and he saw Ruby emerge from the crowd and point blank shoot and kill Oswald. According to Nick Ruey, who was Nixon's body man, Nixon sat up bolt right and said, I know that man. That man, I know that man. The man, Jack Ruby, whose real name was Jacob Rubenstein, had been hired by the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 50s, in the 40s, when both Nixon and Johnson had been in the US House. Nixon had some excess staff money. As a courtesy, Johnson went to Murray Schottner, who was the mob lawyer and chief political advisor to Nixon, and arranged for Rubenstein to get on the House payroll. I was able to locate the payroll records of the US House of Representatives reflecting all of that. So that connects Jack Ruby, the man who shot and therefore silenced Lee Harvey Oswald, to Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Fascinating. Roger, speaking of Nixon, who knew many things about the JFK assassination and the cover up, A lot of people who think that they kind of know what Watergate is about might want to listen and read the evidence that you give, that Nixon had on some occasions threatened to reveal the truth about the JFK assassination, and it turns out that Watergate is actually connected to all of this.
What you say is true. In fact, Tucker Carlson had a stunning report about this several months ago. Among the Watergate era White House tapes that were more recently uncovered is a meeting at the beginning of Watergate when Richard Nixon is meeting with Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, with whom Nixon had a very distrustful relationship. Nixon is trying to leverage help from the CIA to escape Watergate. Nixon does not yet know, as we would find out many years later, that the Central Intelligence Agencies deeply involved in the Watergate break-in. They're well aware of it in advance. In fact, they infiltrate the Watergate burglar team. 4 of the 8 burglars are still on the Central Intelligence Agency payroll at the time. But more importantly, you see Nixon really maneuvering. He says to Helms, look, things could get really bad here. And there's a lot of dirty business over there at the agency, things that I know about, things that I lied to cover up. We both know they needed to be done. But I just want you to know that when the chips are down and people start asking questions, you don't have to worry about me. I'm going to maintain the cover up. I mean, let me put it to you this way, Dick. I know who shot John. There it is, laid right out there. Politico reported it to their credit. And Tucker Carlson reported it. Beyond that, it got almost no coverage.
But somebody whispered in Tucker Carlson's ear, didn't they? He's not revealing who it is or who it was, etc. But Tucker knows quite a bit about this. He's talked to quite a bit about this. And what Tucker was saying as well is why those remaining documents are not being released got something to do with CIA, right?
I think there's no question. So the 1977 Presidential Records Act requires that all of the Kennedy assassination related documents were to be released in 2017, with the only exception that the President of the United States had the authority to delay that release. I spoke to President Trump at the time. I urged him to release it all. It had been over 50 years. But in the end, Mike Pompeo, the CIA director, convinced Trump that it would reveal the Central Intelligence Agency's sources and methods. I argued, Mr. President, that's ridiculous. The sources are all dead. And the methods, well, if the CIA was involved in the murder of an American president, we need to know that. In the end, Trump released about 80% of the documents, but he held back about 20%. Fast forward to the presidency of Joe Biden. The new date has been set by essentially Trump kicking the can down the road. And Joe Biden makes the same decision. He releases a few documents, but he holds back a substantial amount. What is it that they're hiding? I asked Trump about it directly more recently, and he said, it's so horrible that I can't tell you. Someday you'll know, and it will all be clear. Both Tucker Carlson and I, our conjecture is that once all the documents are known, the American people will realize that the Central Intelligence Agency played a critical role in the murder of an American president. That is what I believe they're hiding. Now, we have substantial evidence of that in the documents they have already released, but I think the final coup de grace will come when all those documents are released.
Roger, Jackie didn't change, and there was still blood on her clothing when Lyndon Johnson was sworn in. That's another whole story. Very strange how that all happened. But Jackie, somebody had said to Jackie, "Oh, you still have the blood on you. How come you didn't change?" She said, "I wanted them to see what they did to Jack." Something of that nature, right?
Yes, that's correct. First of all, the swearing in is completely unnecessary. There is swearing in. As soon as the president of the United States is declared by his doctor to be dead, the vice president immediately assumes the power and the authority of the president. So Lyndon Johnson, in order to twist the knife in Robert Kennedy, called him and said, "Bob, I want you to look up the oath of office for me. I'm going to have myself sworn in." And the judge who swears him in is a judge that John F. Kennedy has refused to put on the federal bench. She would be appointed to the federal bench almost immediately by Lyndon Johnson. Johnson is actually caught winking at one of his crony congressmen after taking the oath, but he wanted the imprimatur of Jackie Kennedy for the legitimacy of his presidency. And as I reflect in my book, Johnson's great fear was that Robert Kennedy was going to challenge him. Robert Kennedy was going to put two and two together. We know that Robert Kennedy summonses John McCone, the head of the CIA, to his home, Hickory Hill in Virginia, and asks him point blank, were you guys involved? Did you guys kill my brother? McCone denies it. But there's substantial evidence that those around Kennedy, including Robert Kennedy, suspected the involvement of Lyndon Johnson in the murder of John Kennedy.
Roger, so Inga was used to influence Kennedy. Inga was used to influence Gerald Ford. But it turns out that even Robert was a little bit silent on this issue. And it turns out that Marilyn Monroe was used in the same way that Inga was used. And not necessarily from the get-go, but later in terms of what was found out and how Robert was threatened with this being exposed, correct?
The role of Marilyn Monroe here is very interesting. She very clearly had an affair with John F. Kennedy. She was far too talkative. She also, I think, got passed from John Kennedy to Robert Kennedy. She would not stop calling the White House switchboard, demanding to talk to the president. She was a loose end. And it's a loose end, as you know, that got tied up when she was murdered in Los Angeles. There are numerous accounts of that put Attorney General Robert Kennedy at the crime scene almost immediately after her murder. He actually got a speeding ticket from the California Highway Patrol that same day, which establishes that he was in Los Angeles, that he was in the Hollywood area. That's a whole separate book. Somebody has written that book. I have not. I touch on it in my book. But yes, Marilyn Monroe is a loose end for the Kennedys. It's also, interestingly enough, part of the story as to why Frank Sinatra, who had been a great supporter and friend of John F. Kennedy's, falls out with the Kennedys because John Kennedy is scheduled to visit Palm Springs. He's scheduled to stay with Old Blue Eyes. And then Robert Kennedy objects because of Sinatra's mafia ties, which is ironic because John Kennedy had been elected with the assistance of the mafia, as I outlined earlier. Sinatra goes so far as to build a helipad on his property so that the presidential Marine One helicopter with John F. Kennedy can land. And at the last minute, the schedule's plan is changed. And the greatest insult of all time, John Kennedy stays at the home of Bing Crosby in Palm Springs. Crosby is an active Republican. That was the end of Frank Sinatra's relationship with the Kennedys. By 1970, Sinatra had become a Republican and was supporting the California reelection of Governor Ronald Reagan, would go on to support Reagan for president in 1980.
Roger, as you document, many others do, I just want to talk about the sick mind and nature of Lyndon Johnson that you have mentioned also on the show. You document in your book at least 8 murders he's connected to, so he wasn't new to all of this. Very strange tale too. I try to keep this show PG, but something about some of his behavior and certain substances in a jar that he did, if you want to maybe talk about that. But even after...
Let me speak to that. First of all, if folks decide they want to buy this book, don't buy the paperback, don't buy the hardcover edition. Make sure you get the paperback edition because it has 3 additional chapters. And a lot of information that I added to the book later came to me after I wrote the original version. What you say is absolutely true. I think Johnson may have been responsible for as many as 14 murders to cover up voter fraud, murders to cover up the epic corruption of both he and Billy Sol Estes. Billy Sol Estes, who I referred to earlier, one of Johnson's co-conspirators, after he got out of prison, would insist that he was present when the murder of John F. Kennedy was being planned. provided a lot of detail. That's why in Robert Caro's epic multi-volume Pulitzer Prize winning biography of LBJ, strangely enough, Billy Sol Estes is never mentioned, not once, which is virtually impossible. The other factor here is Madeline Brown. Madeline Brown was Lyndon Johnson's mistress. Madeline Brown bore Lyndon Johnson a son. You can see pictures of him online. He looks strangely almost exactly like his daddy, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Madeline Brown gave multiple interviews and in which she said that she spent the night with Johnson in the Fort Worth hotel the night before the assassination, and that Johnson told her both the night of before the assassination and the morning of the assassination before leaving the hotel, after tomorrow, later he said, after today, I will never have to put up with those Irish sons of bitches again. So
Wow.
that is an admission right there, which, you can go on YouTube, by the way, and see the interviews with Madeline Brown. They're still up and available.
Mm.
Now, interestingly enough, Geraldo Rivera
Mm.
is the journalist who did the first breakthrough interview with Madeline Brown. And I had an opportunity to meet Geraldo in the green room at Fox many years later. And I told him I had used his interview with Madeline Brown in my book with proper attribution. And he looked at me and said, "Who?" I said, "Madeline Brown, Lyndon Johnson's mistress." He said, "I really don't know what you're talking about." It was very interesting.
Roger, but he was a mean man. Like, even with Jackie, after Kennedy's assassination, he called her saying, "Hey, I'd love to be the stepdaddy of your children," or something of that nature. Just really cruel and malicious.
He was a sadist. He was most famous, as you may know, for conducting White House staff meetings while sitting on the toilet defecating. He did this because he could. He did it to humiliate the young Ivy League aides that he had inherited from President John F. Kennedy. So he was a psychopath. He was a functioning lunatic. As I said earlier, a pill popper, an alcoholic, a chronic womanizer. They called him in Texas. He was called Lying Lyndon because he lied about everything, including his military record. He had never served. He claimed to be visiting a war zone as a congressman and been under enemy fire. That turns out to have been a fabrication as well. He was a master politician, but as Richard Nixon was caught saying on tape in an outtake, he was literally an animal. He was indeed an animal.
E. Howard Hunt also confessed something on his deathbed about all of this.
Yes. First, I think we have to tell people who E. Howard Hunt was.
Okay.
E. Howard Hunt was a legendary CIA operative who had been deeply involved in the coup in Guatemala, also in the Bay of Pigs. On his deathbed, according to his son, St. John Hunt, who co-wrote the book, The Bush Crime Family with me, E. Howard Hunt confessed to his son that he indeed had been on the ground in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, that he was a backbencher. He was not a principal in the plan to kill John Kennedy, but he said the man in charge, the man running the show, was Lyndon Johnson. So not only does J. Edgar Hoover can be heard in recorded conversations on the phone telling Johnson, "Mr. President, the Russians, we've just intercepted a report by the Russians. The KGB has investigated. They've come up with a conclusion as to who killed John Kennedy." Johnson said, "Well, who did they conclude did it?" And Hoover said, "Well, sir, they say you did it." We also know that French intelligence did their own investigation, told Jacqueline Kennedy that their conclusion was that Lyndon Johnson did it. Now, I stress again, he didn't do it alone. Others were involved in this plot. Each of them had their own motive, but Johnson's motive was to avoid prison. He was the man staring in the abyss in the Bobby Baker scandal and the Billy Sol Estes scandal. Robert Kennedy had begun telling people that Johnson was not only going to be dropped from the ticket, but was going to be going to federal prison. So it was kill or be killed. It's probably a good way to wrap this up. We know that the most powerful, influential, syndicated columnist of his day, Drew Pearson, had a column in the can that would have run on November 23rd, 1963, that directly accused Lyndon Johnson of taking a multi-million-dollar bribe in return for delivering a defense contract for General Dynamics, a Texas company, and that was the beginning of the end for Lyndon Johnson. It is only because of the murder of John Kennedy that the syndicate spiked that column and it never ran.
Roger, there's another 2 million things I would like to ask. Perhaps I'll bring you back and we can continue this discussion. Just a couple things I want to get to, and perhaps we'll let you rest a little bit this evening. Roger, a lot of people might say, oh, well, this is long ago, it's the past, but in many respects, Roger, what we see happening today to Trump, to you, to Michael Flynn, to the J6 political prisoners, what we have found out about the FBI and CIA intelligence services on many levels. With JFK, in many respects, the foundation or one of the foundations or one of the examples that something is very wrong. There is a deep state. There are these elites. And Eisenhower had warned about this, but this is very, very relevant to the corruption today and to the war on the freedoms in our country, right?
I absolutely think that 1963 is exactly what Eisenhower warned us about. He warned about the rise of an unelected military industrial complex. John Kennedy was murdered by them. He was removed in a bloody coup. Kennedy did not want war with the Soviets, but war is extraordinarily profitable. Richard Nixon would later be removed by them in a silent coup because after winning one of the greatest landslides in American political history, it was Nixon's intention to deconstruct the CIA and completely restructure our intelligence agencies, which challenged their power. So I think he was taken out in Watergate, which is a whole different story. I've written 2 books on that as well. You could fast forward to the assassination attempt on President Ronald Reagan. I'm working on a book on that now, which really puts it right at the feet of then Vice President George H.W. Bush. Just to let me give you a preview. We know that John Hinckley fired 4 shots. We can account for every one of those shots, but none of them hit Ronald Reagan. Hinckley is in a crouching position, and all 4 shots are accounted for, whereas Reagan is hit from above and from behind, whereas Hinckley is before him at all times, in front of him. We also know that when the doctors get President Ronald Reagan to George Washington University Hospital, several x-rays are conducted. They can't find a bullet. They find a wound. They see that he's bleeding, but they can't find a bullet. They're about to close him up. When one of the doctors decides he's going to explore with his fingers, he comes up with a flat cylinder like the size of a dime, which is called a flechette. If you look at the church committee hearings into the excesses of the Central Intelligence Agency, speaks extensively about a weapon designed for assassinations by the CIA, which fires this flechette projectile, which is noiseless but deadly. It had lodged just inches from Reagan's heart. There's both Judy Woodruff and Leslie Stahl. Judy Woodruff, then of NBC, Leslie Stahl of CBS, both report in real time seeing a man on a balcony above the entrance of the Hilton Hotel who's clearly brandishing a weapon. You can't find that on YouTube. It's been scrubbed, but I have copies. So that event, I think, is also tied to the Central Intelligence Agency and George Bush. Then they tried to take Reagan out in connection with the Iran-Contra scandal. That failed. These are the same institutions who put forward the Russian collusion hoax.
Yeah.
impeachments of Donald Trump. These are the same
Yes.
unelected, powerful elite of both parties who have been running the country. And now they seek to lock Donald Trump up and avoid having a free, fair, honest, and transparent election.
Yes, and Roger, in terms of your case, what was it, 5, 6, 7 in the morning? I think the media already knew about it. Why did they need all the helicopters, the SWAT, the Army, FBI, whatever all of that was? What was it done to humiliate? Were they sending a message? It's completely unnecessary, all of that. Why don't they do that to Hunter Biden? Or to Hillary, or to Hillary, or to Hillary. Do it to Hillary.
An excellent question. Look, there was no Russian collusion, so it's impossible for me to have lied under oath before Congress in my voluntary testimony about it. Nor did the government provide any evidence that I was a go-between for WikiLeaks and the Trump campaign. They provided no evidence of that either. I was basically charged in a confection and a fabricated process crime to pressure me into testifying falsely against Donald Trump. When they could find no Russian collusion, they sought to invent it. They wanted me to say that some 29 cell phone conversations that I had with candidate Trump had to do with WikiLeaks, the Russians, and so on. It was a lie. I refused to do it. To the extent that anyone knows who I am today, it's because 29 heavily armed FBI agents in full SWAT gear stormed my home at 6 o'clock in the morning, fully automatic M4 assault weapons. They arrived in 17 armored vehicles. There was a military helicopter overhead, 2 amphibious units at the dock, because I lived on a canal behind my home. An unnecessary show of force for the first time nonviolent crime, allegedly, of lying to Congress. Normally, in a white collar crime like that, they would simply contact your lawyers and tell you to turn yourself in. But this was staged for CNN in order to intimidate me and also send a message to others and to vilify Donald Trump. I thank the good Lord that I was fully and unconditionally pardoned, which leaves me free to be with you today to tell that story and the truth about who murdered President John F. Kennedy.
Roger, just on a personal note, I had to ask you this. When you were pardoned, I remember seeing a clip of a video of you very happy celebrating. You were with some people, I can't remember who they were, and some music was playing and you were dancing, if my memory's correct. You looked like a really good dancer. Did you used to tear up the dance floor in your youth, or what was going on there?
I'm half Italian, specifically Sicilian. So yes, I definitely know how to shake a tail feather. I was dancing with my daughter and my wife.
I was very impressed with the dancing skills.
So much. This has been great. It has been a long day, and I would love to come back and continue this conversation on another occasion. But I thank you profusely for having me. I'm tired if I apologize if I'm running out of steam, but it's a long day here on the East Coast.
Roger, it was such an honor. With those people on the edge of their seat right now, where do you advise that they go to check you out and follow you everywhere?
Go to stonezone.com, stonezone.com. You can get your copy of The Man Who Killed Kennedy, the case against LBJ. If you buy it in the store at stonezone.com, you get a signed copy. So don't give your money to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or eBay or some company that hates your guts. Give your money to me, and you will get a personalized copy. Again, I only sell the paperback edition because it has 3 extra chapters, and it is much better than the hardcover. You can also get my other books, The Bush Crime Family, The Clintons' War Against Women, The Making of the President 2016, How Donald Trump Orchestrated an American Revolution, or your Roger Stone Did Nothing Wrong t-shirt, a number of other items. So go to stonezone.com. Subscribing is absolutely free. You can see the daily show that I do on Rumble, or you can subscribe to me on Rumble or follow me at rumble.com/Roger Stone. We talk about politics at 8 o'clock at night, 5 days a week. Check it out.
Roger Stone, what an honor and privilege to have you here. Thank you for being on the front lines fighting for freedom and truth. I've also watched some of your Christian testimony in terms of what Jesus has done for you through all of your difficult circumstances. I'm a Christian as well. Wherever 2 or 3 people are gathered in his name, he is here with us. Keep up the good fight. The Glazov Gang loves you, and stay strong, my brother.
God bless you, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, make sure to go to thestonezone.com and get The Man Who Killed Kennedy, the case against LBJ. Make sure you're watching the Glazov Gang and subscribe to our Rumble channel and click instant notifications. We'll see you soon. Good night.